the night Calloway Reston decided to humiliate a waitress in front of 47 of Manhattan's wealthiest people, he had no idea he was about to make the worst miscalculation of his career. The private dining room at Aurelius on East 61st Street was the kind of place that didn't appear on any public reservation list. You were either invited or you didn't exist. The walls were lined in dark walnut, the lighting warm and deliberately dim, the kind of dim that made everyone look like they belonged in an oil painting. The tablecloths were so white they seemed to generate their own light. Somewhere near the back, a small cart held a bottle of 1996 Petrus that no one had opened yet because the night was still young, and Reston liked to make people wait for the good things. He sat at the head of the long table the way men like him always sat, like the chair had been built specifically for his body, like the room had been arranged around his presence. Calloway Reston, 53, founder of Reston Capital Group, a man whose name appeared in financial headlines often enough that his assistant had set up a Google alert just so he didn't have to. He was not an ugly man, but there was something about the set of his jaw, the particular way his eyes moved around a room, cataloguing, assessing, dismissing, that made people instinctively straighten their posture when he looked at them. His guests that evening were the usual constellation. 2 hedge fund managers from Midtown, a tech founder who'd sold his second company 6 months ago and hadn't figured out what to do with himself since. 3 partners from a private equity firm in the Flatiron district, a senator's chief of staff, and various wives and companions arranged along the sides of the table with the careful spacing of a seating chart designed by someone who understood power dynamics better than they understood people. The waitstaff moved through the room like well-trained ghosts. That was the point. You weren't supposed to notice them. Mara Ellison noticed everything. She had been working the floor at Aurelius for 14 months, long enough to know which regular guests preferred their water still without being asked, long enough to know that the sommelier, Pascal, had a tell when he was bluffing about a vintage, a slight tightening around the left eye, and long enough to know that private dining events like this one always ran 40 minutes over schedule, and that the kitchen would be irritated by 10:30. She moved between the tables with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to make a difficult thing look effortless, which was, in her experience, one of the most undervalued skills in the world. She was 29. She had a face that people sometimes called striking when they meant to say something more complicated, wide-set dark eyes, a mouth that defaulted to a neutral expression that some guests read as coldness and others read as composure. Her hair was pulled back the way it always was for service. She wore the restaurant's standard uniform, black, fitted, unremarkable. The point was to disappear. What the 47 guests in that room did not know, and had no reason to know, was that 3 years ago, Mara Ellison had been 6 weeks away from completing her degree in biochemistry at Columbia. She had been the kind of student that professors mentioned in conversations with other professors, not in a showy way, but in the quiet, specific way that meant something. She had a fellowship lined up. She had a plan. Then her mother had been diagnosed, and the plan had stopped mattering. The medical bills accumulated the way debt always does. Slowly at first, then, all at once, her younger brother was still in high school. Her father had been gone since she was 11, so Mara had withdrawn from Columbia, picked up as many shifts as she could carry, and built a different kind of life than the one she'd been building. She did not talk about this at work. It was not the kind of thing you talked about at work. Her mother was in partial remission now. It had taken 2.5 years and a sum of money that still gave Mara a cold feeling in her chest when she let herself think about it. She was paying down the last of it, month by month, shift by shift, moving through rooms like this one, with water pitchers and bread baskets, invisible by design. The evening had been unremarkable until approximately 9:15, when Calloway Reston decided he was bored. It happened sometimes with men like him. The food was good. It was always good at Aurelius, and the conversation had covered the expected ground. Market positions, a pending merger, something oblique about a real estate deal in Dubai that none of the women at the table were meant to fully follow. The Petrus had finally been opened, and Reston, surveying his court, had decided it needed entertainment. There was a small upright piano in the corner of the private dining room, an antique, genuinely old, there more for aesthetic than function. Aurelius occasionally had a pianist for certain events. Tonight was not one of those nights. Reston pointed at it. "Does that thing work?" he asked. To no one in particular. Pascal, the sommelier, who was pouring for the table and had excellent instincts for danger, answered smoothly. "It's tuned, Mr. Reston. We have it maintained." Maintained. Reston repeated the word like it amused him. "By whom?" The ghost of Liberas. A few people laughed. The hedge fund managers laughed the loudest, which was predictable. Can anyone here play? A small silence settled over the table. The particular silence of people who could afford to be proficient at many things, but were not especially eager to perform. One of the private equity partners, a man named Douglas, said he'd played as a child. His wife looked at him in a way that suggested this was an exaggeration. "I'm asking who can actually play," Reston said. "Not who took lessons for 3 years and then quit." More silence. Reston's gaze moved around the room in its habitual cataloguing way, and then, for reasons that had more to do with boredom than malice, though malice was certainly available to him as a resource. It landed on Mara, who had just finished refilling the water glasses at the far end of the table and was moving quietly toward the service door. "You," Reston said. She stopped. She turned. The room had gone slightly quieter, that particular quiet that precedes something people aren't sure they want to witness. "Me, sir? Do you play?" It was the kind of question that had a correct answer in the context of a room like this one, and the correct answer was no. "Thank you. I'll return to being invisible now." Mara understood this. She had been navigating rooms like this for 14 months, and before that rooms of a different kind, but with the same basic social architecture. She knew the correct answer. "I do," she said. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it. Later, she would think about this moment and wonder if it was exhaustion. 14 months of careful invisibility, of making herself smaller than she was, of moving through a world she'd been trained for, but excluded from, through a sequence of events that had nothing to do with her ability and everything to do with circumstance. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she was just tired. Reston's eyes sharpened with interest. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir?" "Well?" He leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who had never needed to earn the space he occupied. "Let's hear it." There was a quality to how he said it. Not quite a dare, not quite a command, but something that occupied the uncomfortable space between the two. Several of the guests shifted. One of the women near the middle of the table, the tech founder's companion, a sharp-eyed woman named, according to the reservation, Beatrice Lowell, pressed her lips together in the way of someone who had seen this kind of thing before and did not enjoy it. Mara set the water pitcher down on the service station. She walked to the piano. The distance was maybe 20 feet. It felt longer. The piano bench had that particular settled weight of old furniture, the kind that feels anchored to the floor. She sat down, adjusted the bench slightly. The instinct was so automatic she didn't notice herself doing it, and placed her hands in her lap for a moment, looking at the keys. Was very quiet. The room was whisper quiet. She heard someone whisper something at the far end of the table, and then stop. Reston's voice came from behind her, not quite loud, but calibrated to carry. "We don't have all night, sweetheart." The word landed the way those words always land. She felt the small, familiar tightening in her jaw. She breathed once through her nose. And then she played. She started with Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor, not because it was the most obvious choice or the most showy, but because it was the piece she'd played most obsessively at 19, when she'd been trying to understand something about grief and hadn't had the vocabulary for it yet, and had found it unexpectedly. Here, her hands remembered what her mind sometimes forgot. The opening, quiet and searching, moved through the room like something that had been waiting. The first thing that changed was the whispered conversation at the far end of the table. It stopped. The second thing was Douglas's wife, who put down her wine glass. Reston's face, which Mara couldn't see, but which several people at the table could, went through a sequence of small adjustments. The slight smirk that had been there, the amused proprietary look of a man who had expected mild competence and planned to be generously condescending about it, began incrementally to change. His fingers, which had been tapping lightly on the tablecloth, went still. Mara was not thinking about Reston. She was not thinking about the table, or the waitress, or the 47 people arranged behind her in their careful seating chart. She was thinking, insofar as she was thinking about anything, about her mother's hands. How they'd looked in the hospital during the second round of treatment, the particular quality of the afternoon light through the window of that room, and how she'd sat in a plastic chair next to the bed and wished, fiercely and uselessly, that she could do something with her hands that would matter. She played for 6 minutes. The ballade builds. It is not a gentle piece, not at its core, whatever the opening might suggest. It accumulates, it earns its crescendo. By the time she reached the final section, the coda that crashes through like something that can no longer be contained. The room at Aurelius on East 61st Street was so silent that you could hear the traffic 4 floors below on the street. She finished. She let the last note decay into the room's quiet. Then she placed her hands in her lap and waited. The first person to react was Beatrice Lowell, who started clapping. Not polite applause, not the measured 2-3-4 of socially obligated appreciation, but actual clapping, quick and genuine, the kind that comes before you've decided to do it. The rest of the table followed within seconds. Mara stood, turned, and gave a small nod, not quite a bow, just an acknowledgement, and walked back toward the service station. Her face was composed. Her hands were steady. Inside, something that had been clenched for a very long time was slowly, carefully beginning to open. Calloway Reston did not clap immediately. He sat looking at the piano for a moment longer than everyone else, with an expression that several people at the table would describe later to their spouses, to their friends, as something they hadn't expected to see on his face. Discomfort, maybe, or the specific discomfort of a man who has realized mid-gesture that the gesture has revealed more about him than he intended. Clapping, late, measured. His eyes found Mara as she reached for the water pitcher. "Where did you study?" he asked. His voice was different now, flatter, less performed. "Columbia," she said. "I didn't finish." "Why not?" It was an intrusive question. It was the kind of question that relied on the power differential in the room to make itself acceptable, and everyone at the table knew it. And no one said so because that was how rooms like this worked. Mara looked at him steadily. Family circumstances, which was also the most she owed him. Reston nodded slowly. He picked up his wineglass, looked at it, set it back down. "That's a significant loss," he said, "for Columbia." It was as close as he was going to get, and everyone in the room understood that too. The tech founder, a younger man named Sutherland, who had the particular anxious energy of someone who'd gotten rich quickly and hadn't yet decided what he thought about that, leaned forward. "Did you compete? Seriously compete, I mean, not just recitals." Mara tucked a small order pad into her apron pocket, which she didn't need to do, which was something to do with her hands. "I placed second at the Northeast Collegiate Piano Competition my sophomore year," she said. "I wasn't planning to pursue it professionally. I was studying biochemistry." "Biochemistry," Sutherland repeated, in a tone that suggested he was recalibrating something. "And piano," Mara said, separately. "They're not as different as people think." She picked up the water pitcher. "Can I get anyone anything else?" The table was quiet for a moment longer. Then Beatrice Lowell laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm. "Darling," she said, "you can get me another glass of the Petrus, and I would be in your debt." The mood in the room had changed in the way that moods sometimes do when something genuine has entered a space that has been, until then, entirely performance. It was subtler now, and warmer and slightly off-balance in a way that felt more honest than anything that had come before. Mara moved through the room, refilling glasses, taking the small requests that followed: more bread, a different fork. "Can you ask the kitchen if they can do the bass without the sauce on the side?" The work was the same work it had always been. Her hands, tanned, were steady, her face was composed. But something had shifted, internally, in a place she didn't entirely have language for yet. Near the end of the evening, as the table was clearing, the guests gathering coats, exchanging the lingering goodbyes of people who'd had enough wine to be genuinely warm toward people they'd be professionally cool toward tomorrow. Beatrice Lowell caught Mara near the service station. She was a woman in her mid-50s with the particular kind of self-possession that comes from having navigated rooms like this one for 30 years on her own terms. Rather than anyone else's, she pressed a card into Mara's hand. "My husband runs a foundation," she said. "STEM education, primarily. But we've been expanding into interdisciplinary programs. We're looking for people who understand both sides of the brain." She smiled, and it was a sorry. "Call if you want to talk." Mara looked at the card. It had the clean, spare design of an organization that didn't need to prove anything with its stationery. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Beatrice said. "You gave us the best 40 minutes of a very tedious evening." She moved toward the door. Mara slid the card into her apron pocket next to the order pad. At the coat check near the entrance, Calloway Reston was retrieving his jacket, a dark wool overcoat, heavy and well cut, the kind of coat that signals a specific income bracket without requiring any additional information. His driver was waiting downstairs. He had 3 calls to return and a flight to London in the morning. He paused at the door and looked back into the dining room, where Mara was helping clear the last of the glassware, moving with the same efficient quiet she'd moved with all evening. He stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went through the door, and the cold air of East 61st Street came up to meet him, and the city went on the way it always did, full of people whose entire lives were happening just outside the frame of wherever you happened to be standing. Mara finished her closing duties at 11:40. She wiped down the service station, checked the linen count, handed off the event notes to the floor manager, a quiet man named Henri, who had worked at Aurelius for 11 years and expressed approval exclusively through the absence of criticism. "Good service tonight," Henri said, which was the highest available compliment. She took the staff elevator down, collected her bag from the locker room, and walked out through the kitchen exit onto the side street. The November air was sharp and clean after the warm, weighted atmosphere of the dining room. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing. The card was still to her coat pocket when she changed. She didn't take it out. Take it out now. She would look at it again later, at home, at the small kitchen table where she paid bills and read research papers she didn't have access to through any institutional library anymore, but that she still read, because that was who she was, regardless of what circumstances had interrupted. She walked toward the subway. The street was quiet at this hour, just a few cabs and a delivery truck and the distant sound of something, music maybe, from a bar a block over. She thought about the ballade, the way it had felt under her hands after 14 months away from more complicated than the ambient piano at the bar, 2 blocks from her apartment where she sometimes stopped on her way home, like a language she hadn't spoken in a long time and had assumed she'd lost, returning with a particular fullness of things that were learned deeply enough to be stored somewhere below ordinary forgetting. Her mother had called at 8 that evening, before service, a brief call because Mara didn't have time for a long one. The treatment schedule had shifted. The most recent scan had showed what the oncologist described as a very encouraging result, which was medical language for good news delivered carefully by someone who had learned to be careful with hope. Her mother's voice on the phone had a quality in it that Mara had been listening for 2.5 years without a half year when she replayed it. She heard it now when she replayed it. The subway entrance was half a block ahead. She walked toward it with the particular pace of someone who knows exactly where they're going, even when, especially when, they're not entirely sure what they'll find when they get there. The ballade, at its heart, is a piece about irreversible things, about what happens when circumstances move beyond your control, and you have to find a way to be in relation to that. Not to fix it, not to resolve it into something tidy, but to go on, carrying it, letting it become part of the texture of who you are. That was what she'd heard in it at 19, in a room full of who had come tonight. And room full of people they hadn't expected, gotten something they hadn't. She went down the stairs into the station. The train was 3 minutes away, according to the sign on the platform. She stood at the edge, watching the dark of the tunnel. 3 minutes was nothing. She had waited much longer than that for much harder things. The card was in her pocket. Her hands were steady. Somewhere uptown, her mother was sleeping in an apartment that Mara was 2 months away from helping her move back into from the smaller place they'd taken when the bills had made the old lease impossible. 2 months. It was closer than it had ever been. The train came out of the dark and into the light of the station, slowing with its familiar mechanical sigh. The doors opening, with a sound she'd heard 1,000 times and would hear 1,000 more she stepped on. The doors closed behind her. She didn't know, yet, what she would do about the card. She didn't know if she would call, or if the conversation would lead anywhere, or if anything in her life would look different a year from now than it did tonight. The future had never been a thing she could afford to be certain about. But she knew what she was. She had always known that, even in the rooms where she'd been expected to forget it. She found a seat near the window, and the train moved out of the station, carrying her home through the lit tunnels of the city, and the night went on around her in all its indifferent enormity, and she sat in the middle of it quietly, taking up exactly the space she was entitled to.